Hi folks. Okay, so this week we're going to talk about poverty and education and technology and how the three of those things intertwine. Um, Poverty is probably the biggest issue right now that we face in this country, certainly the biggest issue we face in this world, and one of the very biggest issues we face in education. Some people might say poverty is a culture. I think I've shared with most of you that I don't think of it as a culture because a culture needs to be a group of self-identified people. But certainly poverty affects the cultures that it exists in greatly, including our own here in this country. Certain cultures struggle more with poverty than others. And poverty impairs cultural transmission of learning, both in school and out. If you're struggling to stay alive, the knowledge gets lost. So poverty and culture are intimately intertwined. And as this slide shows, poverty affects people from all cultures. There really aren't any macro cultures that don't have a sector that struggles with poverty. Certainly some more than others, but the picture in the middle shows the many faces of poverty. But we're not just going to look at the problems, thank goodness, or we would all just be depressed and want to quit. We're going to look at the solutions, from the very earliest technology, pens and pencils and reading, to mobile phones, to laptops, computers, solar energy, all kinds of different ideas for helping people move out of abject poverty. So we're going to look at both sides of the coin, what it looks like now, some ideas about why it happens, and then some things that can be done, I really believe. So before we do all that, let's look at how big a problem is this really. Now, the data that I could find on world poverty was from 2012. Basically, 1 in 8 people in the whole world suffer from chronic undernourishment, which is certainly a possible definition of poverty. And what's interesting is the inequity here. The number and the percentage of hungry people in both Asia and Latin America fell from 1990 to 2012 greatly, by about a quarter, but the number of hungry people in Africa rose by 64 million, over a third. Right now, almost 1 in 4 African people is undernourished. And the causes of this are climate, of course, drought, but also war. And these things interact because as nations become more and more desperate for shrinking resources, war is more likely. In the developed world, North America and Europe, the number of people who suffered from chronic undernourishment fell from about 20 million in 1990 to 13 million or so in 2004, 2006, but now it's back up on the upswing. We had 16 million in 2010, 2012. And these figures are from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. Nearly half of the world's population lives on less than $2.50 a day, which is another pretty good definition of poverty. More than 1.3 billion people live in extreme poverty. That would be living on less than $1.25 a day. So less than you put in your parking meter to go to lunch. More than 1.6 billion people lacked access to electricity or any other modern form of energy. They were using wood and charcoal and stuff like that. And 1 billion children worldwide are living in poverty. According to UNICEF, 22,000 children die every single day because of poverty. So clearly in the world, poverty is a huge problem. These figures, by the way, on the bottom are from the Borgen Project site, and if you're interested in world poverty, that's a nice site to explore. But let's focus a little more on the US, and indeed, being very, I guess, ethnocentric, culture-centric, we're going to spend most of our time in this unit focusing on poverty in the US. Things are not that much better, especially for some cultural groups in the US. And again, what we see here is a huge disparity. In the US in 2011, which is again the last set of figures I could come up with, 46.2 million people were living in poverty, 15% of our population. That's defined as an income under $23,000 for a family of 4, under $14,500 for 2 people, under $11,500 for 1 person. But look at the disparities here. 10% of white people, 27.6% of black people, 12% of Asian people, and 25% of Hispanics. 9.9% of the people who live in families in this country with at least one working adult are still in poverty. 21%, almost 22% of all children under 18 are in poverty. Whereas from people 18 to 64, it's only about 14%, only about 9% of people over 64 officially, but many people feel this understates the problem for seniors because seniors face much higher medical bills. Again, let's take a look at marital status. Of families with children overall, 18.5% live in poverty. That's almost 1 in 5 families with children. Okay? If you look at the figure above it, it's more than 1 in 5 children in this country live in poverty. But only 9% of married couples, whereas 41% of mother-only families. That's a huge disparity. About a quarter of all children lived in food-insecure households. 8% had no health insurance. That's no Medicaid, no Peach Care, no nothing at any time during the 2010 year. 41% of households with children had housing problems of some kind. So that's like headed toward half, meaning their housing was substandard, unsafe, not large enough for their family, something like that. Or it took too much of their income to provide housing. It's only supposed to be a third of your income to provide housing. And for many people of the working poor, it's like half. And over 300,000 children in 2009 were homeless at some time during that year. 10% of children lived in families with incomes that were less than 50% of the poverty level. So for a family of 4, that's an income of like $11,500, less than $1,000 a month. These figures came from the U.S. Census Bureau and a website called Kids Count, which is another really good website to look at data on. So I think you can see from these statistics, these dry statistics, that the picture is that there's a lot of kids affected by poverty, a whole lot of kids, both worldwide and in this country. We tend to think in this country everybody has enough to eat, everybody has enough. No, not so. And also the inequity of it. Certain cultures, certain groups, certain people suffer from poverty far more than other people. So why are we looking at poverty anyway? Well, poverty affects not just the basic needs, although that's bad enough. It doesn't, obviously, poverty affects whether you have enough nutritious food, whether you have decent shelter that isn't dangerous, that doesn't have lead paint all over it. It affects whether you have resources like computer access, things like that. It affects all those things. But it also affects a whole lot of other things. And this is a diagram from a sociologist from the 60s called Urie Bronfenbrenner. And he was the very first developmental psychologist, sociologist type person who looked at children not as just as individuals. Before him, the work was usually done saying, well, a 5-year-old should be able to do this, a 6-year-old should be able to do this, and you still see that. And in fact, you see that influence very powerfully in standardized testing, don't you? But he said you can't look at the 5-year-old, you have to look at the 5-year-old within their ecosystem. And so he had all these levels of ecosystem, and you can look at the diagram, but basically poverty affects the doctors that a kid can see, the health care they get, the type of schools that they go to, and we're going to see some stuff on that. The safety and resources in their neighborhood, resources like books, resources like Can you go out and play? Is there a place to play? Is it safe to play? Things like that. Essentially, poverty affects the opportunity that a child has from the day they're born, and the options that they have as they grow, and the options they think they have, the options they see as well. So poverty affects everything in kind of widening circles. So, what are you going to be reading and watching? Well, we're going to take a look at the problems first. The things in here in yellow are the required things. The white print is for the optionals. There's a wonderful video called Wealth Distribution in America. I think you'll find it interesting. Short and interesting. The second video you're going to be watching to look at the problem is, okay, the wealth distribution video looks at what could be one of the reasons that we have so many people living in poverty in a very wealthy nation. America, the U.S. is a very wealthy nation. Why do we have 1 out of 5 of our kids living in poverty? And then Trading Schools is from the Oprah Winfrey Show, believe it or not, and it was picked up by a PBS documentary, and it looks at the disparity in educational opportunities based on poverty. Okay, and then you're going to read an article looking at the disparity in digital technology informational access due to income by Gorski. 2 optionals that I just think you would love. Of course, I don't give you any optionals I don't think you're going to love. There's always so much good stuff out there, and I can't ask you to do all of it. But an article by Scherer called An Interview with Jonathan Kozol. Jonathan Kozol was the author of Savage Inequalities, still one of the very best writers on this topic. The interview was in 1992, and I'm afraid you will find that if you don't look at the date, it could have happened today. And then a very powerful pair of videos called Tammy's Story. The access is in your instructions. If you want to see or step into the shoes of what life is like for the working poor, the generational working poor, this is probably the best picture I've ever seen. If I wanted teachers to understand what some of their kids go through, I think that's what I'd show. Okay, so after we've seen the problems, to avoid just simply quitting at that point, we have to consider, yes, the problems are huge, solving them is going to be hard, but hard is not hopeless. And I've always loved this quote by Margaret Mead, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So we want to be part of that group if we can. Okay, so solutions. You're going to read 2 of these 4 articles, because again, I can't ask you to read everything. Obviously, you're welcome to read all 4 if you want to, but I'm only asking you to read 2. Pick any 2. So the first article by Newman and Solano, Susan Newman has done a lot of research in the field of poverty and neighborhoods and the effects of poverty on whole neighborhoods. And she writes with Solano to talk about if we're going to help poor kids, we can't level the playing field. We have to do more. Bannister and Fisher talk about how one middle school's efforts over a period of 5 years to overcome the digital divide between their students, the ones who had access, the ones who didn't, and all the things they have tried and how it's worked out. So it's a very practical article. Steve Krashen, one of my favorite authors, wrote Protecting Students Against the Effect of Poverty, Libraries. And if you're interested in being a librarian or working in libraries, you want to read this article, because basically he has the statistics to show that libraries are one of the most potent ways to help kids in poverty. But they have to be well-staffed libraries, they have to be open, and they have to have good stuff in them. And then there's an article, a recent article by Templeton called Why Is That Child So Rude? And again, this summer I'm going to be doing some professional development on differentiation for a group of teachers in Richmond County. And I think this is the article I'm going to have them read about kids in poverty. It's just it's real practical, it's real basic, but if I had one article to share with teachers about how to help kids in poverty, it would be this one. So take your pick of those 4, pick 2, and after you've read those 2, there's a video called Harnessing El Sol. I told you we're mostly focusing on the U.S., but this is just such a wonderful solution that's an international solution, such a cool thing that I wanted you to see it. I think you're going to really enjoy it. Optionals, more ideas about solutions. If you're interested in technology and whether, in fact, technology is the thing that's going to help us end poverty, the Boston Review has a wonderful series on their website with a number of top technology people debating this. So if that's something you're really interested in, dig into that one. That one's got a lot of, it's got a big lead article. It's got like 6 fairly lengthy responses. You can just look at whatever you want to play around on that website. If you're interested, if you liked Harnessing El Sol and you want to see more about what technology is doing in the developing world and how design, especially design and technology, can really affect things, you're going to love the video, Highlights of the 2013 Institute for Globally Transformative Technologies Conference at Berkeley Labs. And this is the highlights video, and then if you look in the sidebar on YouTube, you'll see a whole lot of other videos that you can watch if you want to. And since reading is not only one of the most basic educational technologies, but also the one that stands at the root of everything else. If you can't read, it can all be on the web and it won't do you a bit of good. So there's an optional article by King Dickman called How Elena Learned to Read. And again, looking at very practical ways to help kids who live in poverty become readers, because that's the beginning of power for them. That's the real access point. Before they need a computer, they got to be able to read. So that's this week. Lots of good stuff. I'm not going to say enjoy it because it's a little bit depressing too. Remember to answer. When you look at your instructions, you will see that there is a poll you need to answer by Friday, so I can put you in groups for next week, and we'll be looking at small group work on which ideas we like and how to develop them for really making a difference for kids living in poverty.